Who is it?
We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Ah!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sunday, the 29th of October at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. The BBC continues to refuse to label Hamas, the organisation which launched the devastating attack against Israel over the weekend, as what they really are, terrorists. By scrutinising how they have previously handled terror groups, it's become clear that the BBC is treating Hamas as an exception. This is indefensible and must change now. More than £108 million was transferred to cryptocurrency accounts controlled by Hamas and its terrorist allies in the first half of this year. We need to look critically at cryptocurrencies and how they can facilitate complex and deadly terror attacks. Can any lawful person trust them, or are they merely a mechanism for money laundering and illegality? Close at home, amid fears that this week British prisons will run out of space, Crown Court judges have been advised not to jail criminals such as rapists and burglars. A traffic chief has warned that current error rates mean more than 2 million drivers per day could be wrongly fined by ULEZ or speed cameras. And a literary treat to finish off your Thursday. Jacob's Book Club is back, and we have one of the most prestigious authors to kick it back off with. Nigel Biggar will be joining me in the studio to discuss his book Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. State of the Nation starts now. I'll be joined by a particularly enthusiastic panel this evening. I have with me the brilliant historian and broadcaster Tessa Dunlop, as well as the prestigious deputy editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. As I said before, I don't always know the answers. Let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. But now, the lady who has all the answers, Polly Middlehurst, with the news.
Jacob, thank you, and a very good evening to you. Well, the news that is broken within the last hour is that the UK is now sending spy planes and 2 Royal Navy ships to the eastern Mediterranean in new plans to support Israel. The aircraft will begin spy patrols tomorrow. Surveillance aircraft, they're believed to be, to track threats, the government's saying, to regional stability, such as the transfer of weapons to terrorist groups. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, making clear the ministry will be supporting a prevention of a further escalation of the conflict in the area. The British Armed Forces on standby, and they're there to deliver practical support to Israel and partners in the region, they say, to offer deterrence and reassurance. Well, the government's also been organising flights for British nationals in Israel. The first is due to leave Tel Aviv for the UK today. The Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, has been urging British citizens who want to get out to register their presence. Those eligible have been told not to go to airports unless they're instructed to do so. Meanwhile, the Palestinian president has condemned violence against civilians. Rocket fire landing in Gaza City, and Mahmoud Abbas saying the killing or abuse of civilians contravenes morals, religion and international law. His comments come as vital medical supplies run dangerously low in Gaza, with the International Red Cross warning the situation is deteriorating by the hour. The only remaining power station stopped working yesterday in Gaza City. Fuel supplies powering generators for nighttime hours are also dwindling and could run out tonight. Well, the US Secretary of State has described the Hamas terror attack as depravity in the worst. Speaking during his trip to Israel today, he's reassured the Israeli Prime Minister that as long as America exists, Israel will never have to defend itself on its own. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, insisted Hamas should be treated in exactly the same way as ISIS. Antony Blinken said he knows the terrorist group Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people or what he called their legitimate aspirations. The US Defense Secretary is also travelling to Israel tomorrow. Now, news away from the Israel-Hamas conflict. An MP for the Scottish National Party has defected to the Tories today amid reports of toxic bullying culture in the party's Westminster group. Lisa Cameron's defection comes as she was facing a selection battle to be the candidate for a seat in West of Scotland. She said she'd been a victim of group bullying at Westminster and she'd even suffered panic attacks as a result. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, says he's delighted Miss Cameron has joined the Scottish Conservatives. And Bernie Ecclestone has been handed a 17-month suspended sentence after pleading guilty to fraud today. The ex-Formula One boss will also have to pay £652 million to HMRC. He appeared at London's Southwark Crown Court this morning after failing to declare more than £400 million of overseas assets to the government. The billionaire turns 93 later this month. He had been due to face trial in November after he'd previously denied the charge. You're with GB News across the UK on TV, in your car, on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. This is Britain's news channel.
"39 years ago to this day, the 12th of October 1984, the IRA bombed the Grand Brighton Hotel during the Conservative Party conference. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and members of the Cabinet had been staying at the hotel for the conference. 5 people died in the explosion and 34 were injured. When researching the attack today, a BBC resource for students described the IRA as a terrorist organisation who targeted British troops with bombs and shootings. That seems pretty clear-cut then. So why is it now that the BBC is having such difficulty in calling the evil terrorist group which has used such despicable violence in Israel, Hamas, what it really is? A terrorist organisation. Our national broadcasting service seems to prefer to describe members of Hamas as militants, insurgents and attackers. Militant simply means someone who is engaged in warfare. An insurgent is someone fighting against a government or invading force. The definition of a terrorist, though, is a person who uses unlawful violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. This is what has happened. Hamas has killed children. Hamas is a terrorist group, and describing it as anything else is indefensible. In a letter to the chairman of Ofcom yesterday evening, 4 top lawyers rightly pointed out that in an amendment to the Terrorism Act in 2021, His Majesty's government legally recognised Hamas as a prescribed terrorist organisation. According to the BBC's own impartiality guidance, due impartiality does not require absolute neutrality on every issue or detachment from fundamental democratic principles such as the rule of law. There really is no excuse for this shameful fight to apply a gloss to evil. BBC journalist John Simpson said in a message yesterday that it wasn't the BBC's job to tell people who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. The BBC didn't seem too worried about making those kind of delicate distinctions when in the past year alone articles on its website explicitly used the word terrorist in headlines reporting the death of a terrorist in Mozambique and a court case involving terrorism charges in Sheffield. When our apolitical sovereign and the Prince of Wales are able to describe Hamas as what it is, a terrorist organisation, it is appalling that the BBC has the audacity to hide behind the ghastly weasel words of its own patronising style guide, which, of course, it writes itself. As one of my panellists this evening, Henry Hill, wrote in Conservative Home this week, in treating the Israel-Palestine conflict as a special case, latent anti-Semitism begins to manifest itself. If the corporation is perfectly happy to use the word terrorist for other attacks in other places, we can only conclude the reluctance to condemn Hamas reveals its lack of a moral compass. In failing to call Hamas exactly what it really is, the BBC loses its value of impartiality and becomes partial on behalf of evildoers. As always, I want to hear from you, mailmog@gbnews.com. But I'm particularly pleased to be joined by one of the signatories to the letter, Lord Wolfson, who co-signed the letter to Ofcom yesterday. The case you were making was that the BBC has not shied away from referring to terrorists in the past. Why should it make an exception for Israel?
Well, that's right. I mean, our case really rests on 3 legs. There are 3 parts of it. First of all, as you said in your introduction, just the normal use of English language. The word terrorism is the word which would be used to describe what happened on Saturday. Second, as a matter of English law, Hamas is a terrorist organisation. They are proscribed as a matter of law here. Support for them is illegal. And I hope, actually, that the police will be stronger in dealing with pro-Hamas rallies, I'm afraid, which we've seen. The third point is, as you say, the BBC has used the word in other contexts. You mentioned IRA, also Al-Qaeda. It called the terrorist attacks in Paris, in the nightclub, a terrorist attack, which it undoubtedly was. And the question which we are left with, and which was the basis of our letter to Ofcom, is why is this different?
Is there a broader point here that the wokerati, for want of a better term, seem to think of Israel as being different? So the BBC won't say terrorism, Wembley won't light up the arch, Black Lives Matter has been very wishy-washy in its statements about what has happened, that there is a woke reluctance to defend Israel when Israel is attacked.
I don't think Black Lives Matter has been wishy-washy at all. I think Black Lives Matter has been very clear in its support for what happened on Saturday, I'm afraid. What's happened over the last 72 hours is that people have shown their true colours. We have seen tremendous support both for Israel and for the Jewish community here, as you say, from His Majesty the King at the top, through the Prince and Princess of Wales, the Prime Minister. I'm a Tory peer, but I will say that Keir Starmer has been resolute on this issue as well. Ed Davey has given some very good statements, a cross-political stance. So we've seen a lot of support. But we've also seen people who should be speaking out. Why? Because they spoke out in other contexts. And that's the point. It's the difference in treatment which concerns so many of us.
And that's really interesting, isn't it? Because you don't expect people to tweet on everything. It's not compulsory to put your view on every subject. But there are some notable celebrities and organisations who put their views out on everything who are resoundingly silent.
Well, yes. I mean, Gary Lineker, for example, if I can pick on him, he drew a lot of publicity when he compared the government's immigration policy to 1930s Germany. Well, what happened in Israel on Saturday was 1940s Germany. More Jews were killed on Saturday, deliberately, than on any day since the Holocaust. As far as I know, the only thing Gary Lineker has so far tweeted about is to applaud the BBC's stance in not calling Hamas terrorists.
Which is absolutely extraordinary from somebody who normally fills the airwaves with his view on anything and everything.
Well, I'm sure he's been extremely busy on other things and he hasn't managed to get round to condemning unambiguously a terrorist atrocity.
And with the BBC, John Simpson, one of its most distinguished former foreign correspondent, has said in his tweet that he thinks that the BBC is right. He carries a lot of weight, distinguished figure. Do you think the BBC has to separate itself from the British state? We put the tweet up for people to read on the screen. Do you think he's right that the BBC must always be even more impartial than anybody else?
I don't think the BBC should be taking its instructions from the government or the state. I like the fact that the BBC is editorially independent. But if we're going to have a state broadcaster for which we all have to pay, the least we can expect is that it abides by what I would call moral norms. It calls things what they are. And what John Simpson didn't deal with in his tweet was the fact that the BBC, in so many other contexts, as we've discussed just now, has used the word terrorism. I mean, what's clear is that the BBC guidelines do not preclude the use of the word terrorism. Roger Mosey, the former head of BBC Television News, made that very clear in an article in The Guardian.
But also they're the BBC guidelines. They are written by the BBC to have practical day-to-day effect, and if there is an exceptional circumstance, they're only guidelines.
Well, absolutely. But I would say this isn't even an exceptional circumstance.
No, it's obvious.
It's absolutely obvious.
And to come to Wembley, Wembley isn't going to light up the arch. It says that it will have a minute's silence. Again, that's different behaviour from how Wembley normally behaves, isn't it? And that's the problem. It's not that football should be political, because perhaps it would be best if it weren't at all, but that it should be consistent.
Well, I declare my interest. I'm the chair of the Football Regulatory Authority, which is a committee of the FA. I think sport has really two choices. It can either totally stay out of politics, or it can deal in politics. Now, what the FA has done is, in 2016, after a terrorist attack in Turkey, it lit the arch. In 2015, after the massacre in a nightclub in Paris, it lit the arch, and in fact, before every next Premier League game, the Marseillaise was played at every ground. After this terrorist attack, when partygoers, festival-goers, were mowed down in their hundreds, all of a sudden we're told, no lighting of the arch, we'll wear a black armband and have a minute's silence. My concern is, again, why the difference in treatment?
The inconsistency, and the English football team took the knee and joined in with whole Black Lives Matter approach during whatever football championship it was playing a couple of years ago.
Well, I think what we have to do is we have to decide, do we mean what we say, or are we virtue signalling? And if we mean what we say, we have to continue to do it even when it's tough. Now, I appreciate the FA may be concerned about security implications, although I should say the security implications don't come from the Golders Green Bridge Club. But if we want to fight terror as a society, we need to be resolute about it, and that means not giving in.
Is there something more sinister about this? Is there implicit anti-Semitism in the unwillingness to condemn terrorist attacks on Israel that on any other country would be condemned more forthrightly?
Well, I'm always very careful not to throw about the charge of anti-Semitism. What I would hope is that the FA come out and explain very clearly what they haven't yet explained, which is this. What is the difference between the terrorist attack in Turkey and the terrorist attack in Paris, on the one hand, and the terrorist attack in Israel on the other? It's that explanation which I'm hoping that the FA will provide, and they have not yet provided.
And the BBC has, of course, made a statement, which I can read out. It says, the BBC is editorially independent. Our role is to explain precisely what is happening so that the public can make their own judgments. Our long-standing position, including during previous conflicts between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, has been that we do not use the term terrorist without attribution in line with the BBC's editorial guidelines. Well, you can make of that what you will. It'll be very interesting to see what Ofcom has to say, and I hope they respond to you very quickly.
Well, I hope they do as well. And obviously, if there are any substantive developments, I'm sure they'll make their way onto the news and onto your programme.
Well, let's hope so. Thank you very much for joining me, Lord Wolfson. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts, mailmog@gbnews.com. Coming up next, with reports that Hamas has been funded by cryptocurrency, can this form of money be trusted? I'll be asking a Bitcoin expert next.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sunday, the 29th of October at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is still State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. John says, if the BBC were a private company, then I could simply suspend my service and stop paying them. And Tony, terrorism is terrorism. There are no sides. Well, on this subject, it's now emerged that in the first half of this year, the terror group Hamas and its allies received over £108 million in cryptocurrency. As questions about how Hamas funded its devastating attack on Israel grow, cryptocurrency is one method which allows terrorist organisations to avoid global financial sanctions. However, it is apparently possible by tracing the blockchains or records behind crypto payments to find out who the donors were, so it could be that Hamas's sponsors will be uncovered after all. Well, joining me to discuss the rise in cryptocurrency is Leila Halpern, author of Undressing Bitcoin. Leila, thank you very much for joining me. Can you just explain how Bitcoin works in simple layman terms?
Absolutely, great to be here. So Bitcoin is simply peer-to-peer digital cash. So there's basically a decentralized blockchain. I send you one Bitcoin and you'll see that on the blockchain. You'll see that you'll see every single transaction that has ever happened. And it's completely decentralized. So in terms of avoiding sanctions, that might be why you think that you can circumvent different sanctions, because there's no jurisdiction which can shut down the blockchain.
OK, so it can't be shut down, it can be sent end-to-end, and therefore it's a fantastic mechanism for terrorists and criminals. Is that a major problem?
So it's actually not. So as of yesterday, October 10th, the Israeli authorities actually shut down the crypto accounts of those that they think are associated with Hamas or Palestinians or whatever it is. So you have to understand that these cryptocurrency exchanges that hold the Bitcoin, they have to operate and abide by the different regulations of the country which they're operating in. And so the government has the authority to shut this down. Now, of course, there is the chance that they're not using these centralized exchanges, and they are, of course, trading peer-to-peer. But with many of the different cryptocurrencies, especially the ones which use the Ethereum network, like Tether and Circle, well, these can actually be shut down, because these companies that provide these cryptocurrencies, they can shut them down using something very simple like a blockchain analytics explorer. They can basically shut them down using the government, and this happens many times. And even Bitcoin, like I said, you can't shut down Bitcoin, but you can certainly blacklist the addresses, making it almost impossible for people to trade peer-to-peer and actually use the funds to finance these wars.
OK, but if you blacklist some of the names, that's not going to have any effect if it's Iran trading with North Korea, is it? So people can get round that if they're willing to trade with criminal outfits.
That's a very good point. However, what I will like to draw your attention to is the fact that 3 to 5% of global GDP annually is laundered using fiat currency, using cash. When it comes to crypto, less than 0.1% of all Bitcoin transactions, including crypto, is used for illicit activity, less than 0.1%. And so cash is the best way to actually finance these wars.
OK, but that's a great argument in a way, but surely it depends on the relationship between the percentage of crypto that is criminal and the percentage of ordinary cash transactions that are criminal. I mean, you need to look at that balance rather than the total amount, because most transactions are in fiat currencies.
That is correct, but ultimately the blockchain is entirely transparent. And so people can see every single transaction that has ever happened. So, and not just the transactions that ever happened, you can also see every single transaction that's associated with that supposed terrorism or circumvention of sanctions. And because it is entirely traceable, if Iran is doing whatever it's doing with North Korea, the US, the UK, we can all see exactly what is happening. The entire world can see it and then can add their very own sanctions on top of that in other ways that they wish to do that. But the point is that it's entirely traceable in a way that fiat currencies, cash, and no other medium of exchange is.
Well, that's brilliant. Thank you, Layla, for that extremely clear explanation of how you can be tracked if you're a criminal using Bitcoin. If you're a criminal watching, I doubt you are. We don't have criminals watching GB News, but if you are, watch out. With me now is my panel, broadcaster Tessa Dunlop and Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. Tessa, Bitcoin financing criminality, hundreds of millions washing about. Is this something we should be concerned about?
Well, it's interesting because I think 'twas ever thus in terms of financial security. In the early 19th century, we were very reluctant to convert to paper money. Heaven forbid, we'd much rather be weighed down with our golden finger and our jingles and our jangles. And in fact, America were very late to adopt paper currency. It took the Civil War, I think, for the American state to adopt it. So there will be teething problems. There are loopholes. But I thought actually Layla made a great argument. If I give you a counterfeit suitcase, by the way, I've left yours in the green room, of money, who can tell if I've worn gloves? But actually, Bitcoin whizzing between my server and Harry's, which it will later tonight, well.
But isn't it a way that criminals act, that all one ever hears about Bitcoin is that it's used for criminal transactions and money laundering and so on, and the whole essence of it is suspect?
I mean, the primary use case for most cryptocurrencies is buying drugs on the internet. with a secondary use case as a speculative investment vehicle. And there are specific programs which allow you to try and muddle up this traceability that you have with Bitcoin. So I think it was shut down recently. There was something called Tornado Cash, where you took your illicit Bitcoin and it whizzed it up with a load of legitimate Bitcoin to try and muddle the transactions.
Yes.
But I think the most significant thing, which we didn't hear about, is that there is actually one cryptocurrency called Monero, which I think is the third largest, which is completely anonymous. It has a completely separate blockchain, and it is not traceable to any individual. And so most of the serious criminals use that, which is why we don't hear about it.
And when we talk about serious criminals, are we including Hezbollah? Because I heard a very convincing professor last night who said that's one of their huge roles, if you like, aside from lobbing terror-fueled grenades and rockets, is actually money laundering. It's big business and it's like secondary jobs, and they don't have their headquarters, incidentally, in Lebanon. They're probably in Qatar or somewhere else, and it's all very...
It's like the IRA with drug dealing, right? Like this often happens.
The terrorists develop to becoming...
self-sustaining networks,
but it may be
effectively.
worth getting back to the issue we were discussing earlier with Lord Wolfson about the BBC and its reluctance, because you were happy to use the word terror. Why is the BBC not willing to say that Hamas is a terror organisation?
It's interesting. I gave this a great deal of thought this afternoon, to the point that I rang one of the journalists, BBC staff journalists, worked there for 40 years. I rang him at great expense. He was in South Africa, to download his thought process. And I found myself in sympathy to an extent with the BBC. I've gone as a representative, as a freelancer for the BBC, working in foreign countries, and where its great international value is, and some of Britain's huge soft power is in the credibility of the BBC brand, and whether we like it or not, Jacob, that there are people listening, and we want them to hear what the BBC says, because it's an incredibly effective, empirical, fact-sourcing body, and to load terms that might encourage them to switch off, and for them to say it's one-sided. And incidentally, this same journalist gave me the example just today, Tessa. He said, I was lampooned, and somebody put a BBC article down in front of me because it said X number of Israelis killed, X number of Palestinians have died. The BBC has subsequently changed that article. Language can be so loaded, and at the moment we need to take the heat out, not ratchet it up.
It can, but Henry, it seems to me the BBC is willing to call terrorists in other circumstances, and there seems to be something special about Israel.
I think that's the problem, right? I think it would still be misguided if the BBC had a general principle against calling terrorists, but it would at least be understandable. But as you know, I wrote in my piece yesterday, the BBC uses the word terrorist all the time. It applies the word terrorist to groups all the time. Israel seems to be the only exception, or, you know, Palestine and Hamas. And that's deeply unfortunate, because it means it's yet another example, like we've seen with the FA, of an organisation singling out the Israel-Palestine conflict for special treatment.
I don't know if I think that's correct, actually. Did they constantly refer to Sinn Féin and as the political wing of, for example, the IRA as terrorists? I don't know that they always did. If we go back as far as the Second World War, and I know because I've studied it extensively, the BBC tended to remove the emotion from its reporting. They allowed others like you or me to do that. And if we go to the case...
It does use the word terrorist.
It does sometimes.
It does sometimes. Call the IRA terrorists.
And it will say that's a terror act. I don't think there would be any doubt. And the reason we know about the terror acts at the weekend is one of the reasons is the extensive BBC reporting.
But hasn't the BBC dug itself into a hole by being so stubborn on this?
No.
What happened over the weekend was so shocking.
It was so shocking.
So evil.
Which is all the more reason that you dial down the heat around the words you use to platform others to allow
surely
them.
You have to show your horror at what has actually happened. And that when it was on such a scale and so obviously a terror attack, that the BBC has made itself look anti-Israel by not using the word terrorism.
Two really quick points there. You've made a brilliant case for why it's so important in our media landscape. We both have GBNews, which has expressed that horror, and you've delivered the heat, extracting the heat from the light which the BBC showed, those horrific pictures, those images. They have light and you deliver heat, and you need both in a vital media landscape. And the second point is, you could flip that around and say Amnesty International and the UN have referred to what Israel, the way in which Israel govern, both in Israel and in the Palestinian occupied territories, as apartheid. The BBC does not refer to Israel as an apartheid state. It allows other people, Amnesty International, to say that, but it doesn't say that itself?
I think Amnesty's position is pretty ridiculous.
Well, but the UN backs it up. Just to be clear,
but I mean, the UN is a corporate body of
Commission.
I think one point I would make is that it's editorial independent, but the BBC is a British state broadcaster, and in the United Kingdom, Hamas is officially a proscribed terrorist organisation. So therefore, I think that actually referring to them as terrorists is the neutral thing to do, and if you refuse to do that, you're actually editorialising.
But no, hang on a minute, because they're not refusing to say that those acts are terror acts.
But they're refusing to say that Hamas are terrorists, and by law, Hamas are a proscribed terrorist organisation.
But they're platforming them with their terror acts. It's there for all to see.
Right, but then why would they use the name?
Okay, well look at Nelson Mandela. South Africa had him as a terrorist.
He had perpetrated
other people, he was a freedom fighter and remains a hero.
I think the BBC's dug itself into a hole, and if it had any sense, it would dig itself out. However, I'll have my panel back with me again next, but we talk about prisons. Are they becoming too full? And can we really afford to delay sentencing rapists and burglars?
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to ordinary people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News,
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Kenneth says, how can licence payers trust the BBC if it can't call terrorism by its proper name? And David, if you're against cryptocurrencies because their transactions are not traceable, then you must also be in favour of moving cash from society and replacing it with digital currencies for the same reason. Not quite, as it happens, but that may be another discussion. For the first time since 2007 police chiefs are gravely concerned that prisons in England and Wales would have no more room to contain newly sentenced criminals. With just 124 spare places in the male prison system, Crown Court judges have been advised not to jail criminals, including rapists and burglars, and instead hand them sentences in the community. Not only will this fail those who have suffered thefts, attacks and assaults at the hands of these individuals, but it poses a risk to the public of further incidents if these criminals are allowed back in society. Well, my panel is still here, Tessa Dunlop and Henry Hill. Henry, what's happening? It's a Conservative government and we can't even lock up criminals.
Well, I mean, the Conservative government has kept shutting prisons. I think that's probably the main problem. HMP Lancaster recently renovated one of the prisons with the lowest recidivism rates, closed by Ken Clarke in 2011, because he'd really wanted to close it in the 1990s and he didn't like the fact that it was in a castle. And I'm not slandering him. That's what he said in his autobiography. HMP Shepton Mallet closed a few years ago. They haven't been able to redevelop it because the developer didn't get permission. So it's currently...
I worked in Shepton Mallet prison.
Ah, there we go.
Yeah, and there was only one room in the entire prison. It was the oldest prison in England. And it was there was only one window out of which you could see grass.
Right.
And I do suggest that might not be good in terms of the rehabilitation of an offender.
That may be worse than some hypothetical prison we never built, but it's better than the no prison that we replaced it with. And the thing is, they didn't even get to redevelop it. The owner didn't get permission. So it's currently maintained as a show prison, which they use for filming and which you can get tours of. So basically...
It was a staggering, like I said, it was the oldest prison. It was, it was a real... The gates would creak and your thing of keys would jangle and it was properly old school.
But it had cells.
Servicemen during the war, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And it became a sex offenders prison.
But it had cells we could put people in. And the problem is that we've closed prisons like that. And it's true that maybe they're deficient compared to some ultra-modern prisons that they have in Scandinavia, but we've not built any of those. And so the result is that we've had a net loss of prison space, and now that's coming home to roost.
We can't only put it down to infrastructure. If I may just shed a little light in true BBC style and give you some statistics. Between 2009 and 2019, the average prison sentence went up from 13.8 months, so 0.8 months, so however long that is, just over a year, to 18.9 months. That's a considerable leap. Yeah. The average sentence has gone up by a third in a decade.
And it's about to go up even more because the government just mandated that prisoners should have to serve 2/3 rather than half of their sentences before qualifying for automatic release.
So we've got
and I think that's what's brought this to an acute problem.
This philosophy of criminalising society, and it didn't just start with you guys. You can park some of the blame with New Labour,
but
because
actually,
murders went up under New Labour, the prison
But it's not the criminalisation, it's the honesty in sentencing. It seems to me that there used to be a really easy thing for politicians. Politicians stand up and say we'd have longer sentences, it's really important, and people be sentenced to years and years in
love
prison.
it, don't they? They love that you lock them up.
Not sure they do. And then you'd release them more and more quickly, so that the ratio of sentence to time served changed. And this has just begun to push it back a bit, so that people serve more of the time they're sentenced to. And that's honesty with the public.
But if you're going to do that, you need to build more prisons. And I think that's the problem. You can take there's a perfectly honest political debate about whether or not you want more people in prison, fewer people in prison, and all of that. Right, but if you're going to take the more prison or longer service sentences route, you need to build the prison space.
And just quickly, while our prison numbers have gone up, the reoffending rate has not gone down. So these longer sentences, when people are eventually released, because the vast majority of prisoners are released, they are not reoffending less, i.e. they haven't learnt their lessons through the longer sentence.
So that's a really important issue. How do you get recidivism down? But we're going to go on, because we may all be going into prison as drivers. Well, I hope it won't be quite that serious, but 2 million drivers could be wrongly identified for fines by ULEZ or speed cameras every day. Automatic number plate recognition has a 3% failure rate, and because fines are being churned out as a fundraising mechanism by all sorts of councils and so on, a small percentage of a large number makes a lot of people. And this is deeply unfair when innocent motorists, many of whom are simply trying to go about their daily life, are suddenly finding they're getting fines which they shouldn't be getting in the first place. Now, it seems to me that fundamental to the rule of law is that however minor the offence, you should only be charged if there is proof against you beyond reasonable doubt.
Yes.
And the motorist is treated as guilty until proved innocent.
I don't like agreeing with Jacob. It just goes against the grain. It's difficult sometimes to sit in the same room as him.
It's not that bad.
I'm being facetious. But I've got to say, I acquired a car during COVID to visit old women I was writing about. and I very rarely use it. I'm not a nervous driver, but I'm not hugely experienced. And I'm telling you that the few times I used it, almost without fail, I got some kind of fine or penalty for going into boxes, for being in a bus lane, for parking in the wrong place. Once I parked at Morrison's and I discovered it wasn't the supermarket car park, and I got another fine. Literally, I think there was a sort of £300 or £400 in 2 months. I've stopped using the car. I need to sell it. It turns us all into criminals, you're right, and I don't like that.
And this is really unfair, that a 3% failure rate in a criminal justice system working on number plates is outrageous.
And these fines aren't small, right? Like, my little brother drives, and, you know, he already pays a substantial chunk of his post-tax income on ULEZ every month. He missed one payment. Apparently, maybe it was a fault. And it's a £90 fine,
it's
right?
massive.
It's more £12.50 a day or whatever, 90, but that's a huge amount. When you think about the number of people who may have to drive for work in London who aren't on large incomes, think about what 90 quid represents out of their monthly pay. It's absurd.
They rely on you forgetting, and I've forgotten so many times with that trap in the middle, the congestion charge, that I now pay £10 a year so that if they catch me, they immediately put it through so I don't get the £90 late charge or whatever. The whole thing is rigged to make money. It's like another tax, isn't it, effectively?
Yes.
It's so rather than saying this current Conservative administration taxes us at a record level of 37 pence in every pound, which is what it is. In fact, the truth is, if you're a driver, it's about 42 pence in every pound.
So you're a great historian. This is medieval, isn't it? That medieval monarchs used fines as a means of financing the monarchy.
To get away, because tax is so unpopular.
Yes.
You are the same. You are a medieval crook, because you are still part of the administration.
Are you doing it? It's the Sheriff of Nottingham going around.
The thing about Jacob is he's the nearest I get to power, so I have to sort of get it all out of my system.
But the motorist is being harried in this way, partly because that's the way to get to net zero. That it's, if you make motoring less pleasant, people will do it less, you're put off driving, and it's about changing behaviour, and the government doesn't really want to admit that it's trying to change behaviour to get to net zero.
Maybe I'm too cynical, but I actually think it's inverse. I think it's more that the net zero stuff is a really good cover story for just shaking people down for money. I think that's what the councils care about an awful lot more. It's really nice if you've got some kind of noble thing you can put on a press release, but this is about, because the thing is, if there's that £10 service, right, most people don't know that exists. You know that exists.
I know.
But they don't advertise it, do they? There's not signs up saying you can sign up for this handy thing so that you automatically get charged. You know, they could have that would be a really useful thing to have on those billboards outside buses. Is it there? No, you have to hear about it on television.
GB News.
On GB News.
The channel of heat. But just very quickly, I disagree with you. It won't surprise you to hear, Jacob, that I drive a hybrid, but my fines are not less than the diesel guzzler next to me.
No, I drove a hybrid for a...
Yeah, and you don't get fined any less, so why would that be...
You don't get any less, and you're driving around this very heavy battery most of the time, which makes you less fuel efficient. It's not necessarily that green.
Well, I think Harry may have a point that it's not really about net zero. It is perhaps about getting cars off the road, because especially in cities, congestion means they cease to be efficient because there's too many of them. But again, improve public transport.
But they've done everything to make it disagreeable for motorists. They've set the traffic lights to be red more often, they've narrowed the lanes, they've reduced the speed limits. There's a real attack on motorists, with this bit just being the icing on top of the unfairness cake.
And the problem is that there's an awful lot of stuff that you simply can't take out of private transport. You know, I live in London, I don't own a car. Lots of people who live in London already use public transport. It's very well served. But an awful lot of people who aren't going somewhere near a station or who need a van or all kinds of other stuff, they can't just get off the road and sell their car. And that means that this kind of stuff, if sin taxes are supposed to try and discourage behaviour, but if that behaviour is driven by necessity, it's not going to do that. It's just going to screw money out of people.
That is a brilliant point on which we're going to have to end with my absolutely genius panel. Coming up next, the long-awaited return of the book club is here.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sunday, the 29th of October at 9 on GB News.
Join me, Andrew Pearce and Bev Turner, Monday to Thursday, 9:30 a.m.
Who benefits from that? Not the British public.
And on Fridays, join us, Tom Harwood
and Ellie Costello from Britain's Newsroom.
That's what you get with this show. That's fantastic.
If it's happening, we're talking about it on Britain's Newsroom.
GB News, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Put in your mouth. OK. Here comes a train. Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa!
Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and now it's time for the book club. I'm very pleased to welcome the return of the book club, where I sit down with an esteemed author and discuss his latest literary offering. I'm particularly pleased to be joined this evening by Professor Nigel Biggar, Regius Professor Emeritus of Moral Theology at the University of Oxford and author of Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. Professor Biggar's recent book addresses some of the key questions surrounding British history. Was the British Empire driven primarily by greed and the lust to dominate, and was the empire essentially racist? Nigel, your book covers a vast swathe of history. It's a huge scale. Inevitably, in something that lasts for many hundreds of years, there will be good things and bad things. How do you try and judge over such a period and over such different behaviours in different places?
So the first thing, Jacob, is simply to explain that there was good as well as bad, because the story being put about by lots of folk now and being absorbed is that the British Empire was nothing but a litany of racism and oppression and cultural repression. And so I just wanted to say, look, there was good as well as bad. As for trying to weigh these things up to decide which was more significant, I don't think you can. What you can say is that there was nothing in the British Empire that was like Nazism. The British Empire didn't have a kind of crazed heart that was devoted to massively murderous, racist genocide. And you can also add that the British Empire achieved a number of very good things.
To what extent was it driven by money? And people like Clive of India made themselves enormous fortunes by their efforts in India. They weren't entirely free from corruption. Yeah. Was that a primary motivational force?
It certainly was a primary motivational force, and I myself, and I suspect you too, have no objections to making money.
No, not at all.
To make money. So the East India Company, why was it in India at all? To trade, to make money. So trade was a major motive, but it wasn't the only one. I mean, the reason that lots of Brits ended up in North America was they They left poor conditions in the UK, left famine in search of a better life. And then sometimes, yeah.
And the search for the better life then had an effect on the original inhabitants. So you've got Tasmania, and you've got the Aborigines there, who die in very large numbers. Is that one of the great blots on the British Empire, or is it something that has been misunderstood?
Well, a lot of people call it genocide, and my view is that genocide is the wrong way to describe it, because genocide should be defined as the intentional, systematic intention to eradicate a people. And there is no evidence that the colonial government of Tasmania intended that, and indeed it sought to protect Aboriginal Tasmanians from settlers as best it could. It failed.
And many people died. But there wasn't an evil intent, which is important.
Absolutely.
And that also applies to slavery. Now, to begin with, there clearly is an evil intent, and we are great slave traders.
Yes.
And then we become the first country in the world in the whole of history to be determined to abolish slavery. How do you balance that out in your book, the initial evil, but then this remarkable Christian good?
Well, the sense I make of that is to say that, yes, slavery for 150 years was really bad, but, by the way, everybody in the world was doing it. And there was something of a moral revolution in England in the late 1700s, driven mainly by nonconformist Protestant Christianity, that came to the view that some people owning other people as their absolute property was morally unacceptable. And so Britain became one of the first states in the history of the world, as you said, and not just to abolish slave trading and slavery, but then to spend 150 years of the rest of its life suppressing it from Brazil to New Zealand.
And for pointing things out like this, you got an incredible amount of abuse, that there was a strong feeling of shoot the messenger.
Yes, there was. My view is that, having looked at what some of my critics say, is that the abuse was not driven by a concern for the truth about history. It was driven, I think, by a terror that my views actually might get heard and the truth might be exposed. There's a sense of, reflecting on the kind of response I got, a sense of panic on the part of the opposition.
So, putting yourself into the mind of the opposition, if you can, why? Why do they want to say the empire was so bad when it clearly wasn't? It was clearly mixed. It clearly did some wonderful things. It created extraordinary states. It civilized. It spread the rule of law and democracy. It was one of the gentlest empires the world has ever known. So why do people want to say that it was nothing but evil?
I think it has to do with the self-perception and social status of these progressive crusaders, because if they can make out the West, and the record of the West is at stake here, the West and its imperial past to be the worst thing that ever happened to the world, then they get to play the crusader in shining armour on the white horse. But it's not really that they care about the oppressed or the disadvantaged, it's really about them. And I first noticed this when, during the protests to bring down Rhodes's statue in Oxford, you had this bunch of rather privileged students complaining about Rhodes. Who was he? Dead 120 years. Meanwhile, in South Africa, Jacob Zuma is looting the South African state.
Much more concerned about historic failures than current disgraces.
Absolutely.
Well, yep. Nigel, thank you very much indeed. I listened to the book on an audiobook, and I would strongly recommend it. It is truly excellent. That's all from me. Up next is Patrick Christie's. Patrick, what is on your bill of fare tonight?
Yes, well, we have uncovered some absolutely shocking footage of anti-Semitism on the streets of Britain. We'll be showing you that. We'll be talking about what on earth is going wrong in British society. Has multiculturalism actually failed, despite us being told that diversity is our biggest strength? I've got Anne Widdecombe on. I'm going to have Lady C as well for a bit of a royal update. Kelvin Mackenzie joins me. What's not to love?
Oh, that sounds absolutely terrific. That'll be coming up after the weather. I'll be back on Monday at 8 o'clock. I'm on my way down to Somerset now, lucky old me, where the weather will be absolutely delightful. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation, and I'll see you on Monday.
Hello. Hello, I'm Alex Burkill. Here's your latest GB News weather update. It's going to turn wet and windy as we go through tonight into tomorrow, but then something colder is on the way as we go into the weekend. We have an area of low pressure to the southwest of the UK, and it's this that's going to track across England and Wales as we go through tonight into Friday, bringing some heavy rain and strong winds. Further north, there will be some showery rain pushing its way southwards, and with low pressure nearby, northern parts of Scotland are going to be blustery and windy as we go through the night as well. Could be a little bit chilly for some parts of Scotland, milder further south, temperatures in the mid-teens Celsius, but it is going to be a wet and windy start to Friday. And staying wet and windy as we go through much of the day, the heavy rain could cause some problems on the roads, some spray is quite likely, and when you factor in those strong winds, we're likely to see a bit of disruption. The high totals of rain, particularly over the Welsh mountains, could lead to some flooding, and there's the risk of some thunder across southern parts as well. Staying quite warm in the south though, temperatures in the low 20s here, colder further north, even though it will be brighter and sunnier with some showers. Into Saturday, a chilly, perhaps frosty start for many of us, then plenty of showers feeding down on cold northerly winds. So it's particularly towards the northeast of Scotland where they'll be most frequent and heaviest, but they are going to become a bit more widespread as we go through the afternoon. Even the chance of some winteriness over Scotland before Sunday and Monday looks mostly dry but chilly.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?